G'day guys, ZiggyD here, back with Rory Rackham.
How's it going? Still
I'm
good?
Good.
Still
I'm going good.
Good.
I'm here to talk about a bit of a passion project today, though. Not really project. Well, it's been a passion topic for me. I've made videos on it and talked about it quite extensively on stream, and that is immunities, in particular boss immunities. So we're talking things like bosses being immune to freeze, which has been around for quite some time, and more recently with the Atlas of Worlds, some of the Guardians being immune to ignite and poison and things like that. So I want to ask a few questions about this. What was like kind of the original reason why these things were added to the game?
So Atziri was the first boss that really had full immunities to all ailments, actually.
Yeah.
And this was partially because at the time those mechanics trivialized the encounter.
Yeah.
The burn prolif was a big thing back then, also freeze prolif. You could just lock down bosses indefinitely. And although we've made a few other changes to make that less of an issue now, ignite, double dipping and those sort of things have really come to the fore, and so we've got the same thing happening again with the Atlas bosses. We knew before we released the bosses that from testing that a lot of them were just 10 times easier with big heavy degen stacking effects like ignite and poison. And so partially because of theme and partially because we wanted to have different challenges for different encounters, we slapped immunities on these bosses. They're thematic immunities, of course, but they are also pretty crippling for builds that make full focus on them. We knew that, all of the bosses, if you have insane dodging skills, you can kind of survive a lot of the stuff over time. But
yeah, I eventually did Hydra on my poison build, which is almost exclusively poison damage, and I think it took 18 minutes or something. It was a pretty long fight.
There was a sort of considered effort to make it so that certain builds are better at certain Atlas bosses than others.
Yeah, okay.
You can kind of sort of handle all of them if you really push your gear and your skill, but it was considered a cool thing if you're like, oh, I'm really good at the Minotaur, he doesn't mitigate any of the stuff that I do, and I can handle some of his hits because I've got good fizz mitigation or something like that. And this carried over to an extent to the others. We've talked a lot about this in the office, and one of the things that was said is if poison wasn't so extreme over the top right at the very end of the game as it is now, we could just remove the poison immunity and the ignite immunity. And so our focus is really on finding a better way to deal with double dipping, damage bonuses, the sort of things that make ignite and poison so effective, and then we can cut down or remove those immunities. We've also talked about introducing a optional solution for players, a future mechanic that will let players choose to bypass or reduce the power of their own elements to bypass immunities. So they have some alternative they can enable at some other cost to their character that will let them enhance let them get through these things in a more interesting way.
So like an immunity penetration with some form of drawback?
Yeah, or an opportunity cost to it, really.
Okay, so that's interesting, because it sounds like immunities are kind of like a stopgap measure until you can figure out better balanced solutions for things like burn and poison. So then is this more targeted at things like freeze, which might not have that same sort of solution?
Yes. So ideally you would have it, if you really want to focus on freeze, to the point where you can freeze high HP bosses using prolif or just insane damage and freeze duration, then you have an option for what you can do with your character. But yeah, we don't want it to be perma-freezing a boss encounter because they trivialize the content so much.
Okay, have you guys considered other solutions, in particular with the idea like freeze? Because I feel like if you're investing so much effort into making a freezing character, to then get to quite a few bosses that are freeze immune, and then your primary defensive mechanic is essentially completely gone. Have you considered other options like bosses becoming resilient to these effects the more they're used on the boss, for example?
Many of them can still be affected by chill, which we consider a massive bonus, a massive benefit to it makes the fight 30% easier effectively in multiple ways. So this is sort of something we've considered to be the good thing you can get. There's a lot, just applying chilled ground makes it easy, but not every cold build can do this. So it is a sort of space that's lacking. Even then we would probably, if we're doing this in the long term, make bosses more resistant to chill as well, just because it makes the content too easy. But it is a real shame that things like Terran's Shiver that get an actual damage bonus from freeze and similar mechanics can't apply to these bosses. So it is definitely something, it's sort of like the optional thing for being able to mitigate this stuff. That's something where we would provide some alternative effect to freeze when you get this, so the bosses are penalized in some way, just not to the extent of maybe even chill, but definitely not to the extent of freeze. Diminishing returns, though they do solve the problem, they do it in a way that means at the start of the encounter it's very, very easy, and it doesn't play well with our duration based on life thresholds, where like if the first hit feels like, if the first hit is a 5-second freeze, diminishing returns, it's not like we always have half-second freezes. They're massively varied in duration. So it would be a fairly complex and hard for players to understand system, and also something that we're not keen to have like hidden mechanics to do that.
Yeah.
We also have, there's other ways to have reduced effect of these things on bosses, or punishing players for using those elements on bosses, like having counter mechanics that the boss uses.
That was what I was going to touch on, was actually one of the suggestions that I put out in my video was this idea, like, if you ignite the Phoenix, then it gives him some boost or uses some other skill to purge that and deals damage to you or something.
We have a couple of bosses that do this in the game at the moment for curses.
The Joffrey's boss, skeleton,
and Deirdre Darktongue in Malachi's area consumes curses on her to gain a damage boost.
I didn't know that she did that. I thought she just had short duration.
That's exactly why we're not too keen on it, because a lot of people aren't aware that there's visual effects. We have big visual effects on her that does that. She does a special animation to show she's consuming the curse, but because it's not a debuff on the player that they can easily see, it's not easy to telegraph, especially for a new player who's taking on this content for the first time. The first time you get to Act 4 and do that fight, you might get destroyed by it because it's actually adding chaos damage to her. It gives her unholy might when she consumes curses.
Yeah, I didn't know.
But players can't be aware. I mean, we can put something on her saying she consumes curses to gain a powerful buff, but we can't say consumes curses to gain a powerful buff, giving her 30% of physical damage added as chaos damage. So a player doesn't really have the tools they need without looking at the wiki to understand that.
Yeah.
So it's an option, but it's one that we need to then inform players of every time they're coming across this mechanic, unless we're okay with them occasionally getting wrecked for something they didn't understand. But
Path of Exile is kind of good at that. It's like one of the things.
Yeah, but also if your character is built around freeze, you can't exactly turn that off if you want to take on this fight. If your damage is sufficient to beat the fight, but now you're accidentally freezing the boss and then the ice shards are exploding in your face.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I kind of get the distinction there. Curses are kind of like an optional secondary mechanic, whereas something like a poison build has to rejig some things to take it out, or freeze build can't really turn that off at all.
Even then, we'd probably rather, if we could go back in time and change that mechanic to something that's either blatantly obvious or she has a different way of mitigating curses.
We have two good examples of it implemented well in a way players understand, and then it not then, because Joffrey's, for example, players figure out very quickly, like the first time or second time they curse them, that you curse him and then this nasty Nova appears from him. Whereas Deirdre is, I didn't even know that after all this time. So can you look to one of those and maybe implement it in the same way that you've done with the Joffrey?
It's an option, but just saying straight up immunity is much more straightforward for players to understand. And if they know, they've already been presented with the way to bypass it, then they can just switch to that or whatever it is, however that mechanic might work, then that is a lot more player friendly and more the player has more control at that point, where they can choose to engage with this mechanic.
So it sounds like you guys are pretty set on keeping the idea of immunities in the game, but maybe removing some immunities like Ignite and Poison immunity, if you can deal with the balance issues with those particular skills. Okay.
We've talked about having replacing immunity with reduced, or replacing the effect on them with an alternate effect, but it doesn't look like it's too much to add to the game, basically, for a subsystem designed to just prevent exploiting certain mechanics against bosses that are incredibly weak to it, and it doesn't make sense for them to be weak to it.
Okay, so it's like a lot of extra development time to develop alternate skills for each different boss and things like that. So something more widespread would probably be more like something that you can just switch a button onto that boss like you can with immunity. So just like a 75% reduced freeze duration on a boss that's
Something like that, yeah.
currently freeze immune.
We've still got to, I mean, we haven't actually implemented this, we've got to try it out and see how it feels. Having it feel like a clever thing where you're like, I'm outwitting this boss is good, but having it feel like, ugh, I've got to do this thing that ruins my character just so I can do something against this boss, it's a bad thing. We've got to find the middle ground if there is such a place.
That kind of touches on one of the other interesting ways that I think you guys could potentially deal with it as well, which is having different phases within these fights where they are freeze immune. So some sort of buff comes up and then it's immune to freeze during those time. But if you hit it in this part where its defenses drop, then you can freeze it, for example.
That's interesting. Yeah, something like that. It's definitely something we haven't considered yet.
It makes it fight a lot harder for freeze people still, but there's a way of, like you said, feeling clever and getting around it. Like, I know if I hit him with a good freezing, if I curse him and then hit him then, he's going to get frozen and I can get a couple seconds of DPS.
Something like that could work for phase fights and things like that.
So just to recap then, what it sounds like is on the horizon for the near-ish future or something is you guys trying to look at the balance for burn and poison and then potentially removing those immunities, yeah?
Yes. We'll see. Have to see how it plays out. We'll obviously test it a bit locally and probably get community feedback on the results once at the point people can play around with.
That's really good to hear because that's one of those things where I feel like it doesn't really bottleneck the really strong builds that are abusing those mechanics because they just got enough damage anyway, but the builds that are relying on those mechanics, like for example my Viper Striker, not a particularly strong build, very reliant on that poison damage. It was getting blocked out from content. So that's really good to hear. And then the other thing you mentioned was having some way, like a gem or a jewel or a unique or something like that, that allows you to penetrate immunities at some cost to your character for things like freeze immune then.
Yeah, that's what we're trying out anyway.
Okay, well that's really exciting. That's really exciting. Sounds like good things are in the future then for a mechanic that I was less than thrilled with. Right. So that's really good to hear. Awesome.
So hopefully we can have something fun to play with before too long.
Cool. Well, thank you for the insights, Rory.
Of course. Thank you.
Cool.